My name is Jack Isaac Pryor, and the PAD taught me rigor. My name is Jack Isaac Pryor, and the PAD taught me courage.
That's right. Dr. Jack Isaac Pryor learned a couple of things in the PAD. Jack Isaac Pryor is my guest today on episode 11 of the PAD podcast. My name is Rob Morgan. I teach design in the Performing Arts Department at Washington University in St. Louis. Very, very excited to bring Associate Professor of Theater at Penn State Abingdon, Dr. Jack Isaac Pryor. They are a writer, theater artist, and performance studies scholar, specializing in experimental forms, queer, trans, and feminist theories and methods, and the politics of time. I'm very, very excited to bring Dr. Pryor to you. They are just, I think, appreciative in their own words of the conversation to kind of reflect a bit on their time at WashU, and there's lots of great things they have to say about how that formed the person they have become as a studies professor at Penn State Abingdon. So I will shut up and allow you to really get to know Dr. Jack Isaac Pryor. Enjoy. All right, my guest today is Dr. Jack Isaac Pryor. So nice to have you on the podcast. Thanks for joining us.
You're welcome.
So if you don't mind, Jack, I'd love to just sort of, as we do with most of our guests, just sort of start at the beginning and give a little bit of your origin story and how you found your way to WashU and your time at WashU, etc. So if you just start there, that'd be a great place to begin.
Absolutely. So, I'm from the Chicago area. WashU was on my radar. It was a place that, a few people every year from my high school would go to college. And at the time when I was in high school, I started doing theater in high school. So I was thinking about being a theater major then. I had a very influential high school theater teacher and named Tim Ortman. And I was also considering going into journalism. Those were sort of the two paths that I was thinking about. And so I applied to colleges with that in mind. And I remember visiting WashU, and at the time, it's funny looking back, I'm now a college professor, so I have a complex understanding of higher education.
Yes.
It was the first campus that I visited, and I was like, oh my God, there's like a quad and grass and buildings and classrooms. This is amazing. So there's many things that are unique about WashU, but those were not them.
Right.
So, but I was very struck by the beauty of the campus. I recall Corey also talking about this, who's also from Chicago. And at the time, I was also very interested in joining a crew team. I don't know where I got that idea from, like rowing.
Yeah. And those existed, yes, when you were here, right?
Oh, yeah. Is that no longer? There's no longer?
No, it still happens. I just wasn't sure. Yeah. Some student groups and clubs come and go, but I'm glad that one's still around.
Yeah, somewhere in my mind, I probably knew. I did not grow up with wealth, so rowing, which is an elite sport, was not something that was around in my high school or that was on my radar in my network at all. But I was aware of it, I guess, as a sport. And somewhere in my brain, I intuited that it's where the lesbians were. So I was like, I will find the lesbians, and the way that I'll do that is by joining a crew team. I was like a baby queer at the time, and. So I remember visiting WashU, being very struck by the beauty of the campus. And I remember connecting with some folks on the crew team that hosted me while I visited.
Nice.
And I went out on the water on Creve Coeur, and I was hooked. And so, that's
it's interesting.
WashU. Yeah.
I've heard about those crew teams, and it's funny. I totally think that I might be able to measure up even at my current age to doing that type of thing, but it's getting up as early as you have to that I could never do. I understand that y'all have to be there at like 5 a.m. Is that correct?
Rob, earlier.
Oh, ouch.
I think we met at the Vans at like 4 a.m. because it was a 6-hour drive. We would all fall asleep in the van.
Fair.
6-hour drive before. That's when the women practiced in the morning. The men, we could have feelings about this.
Yes.
The men practiced in the afternoon.
Oh, at a more respectable time.
At a more respectable time. But they missed the magic of waking up before sunrise and having that experience. And the sun would always come up as we were out on the water.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a stillness at that hour. And going into, I have a very distinct memory of taking Movement for Actors with Anna Pileggi. And
Yes.
that was a 9 a.m. class, probably, unless there are 8 a.m. It was the first class of.
Right.
And so I would come straight from rowing. And everybody else was just starting their day. I'm like, I've been up since 2, people. Um, and I would go at the time. Now looking back on it, I'm a little embarrassed for myself, but I would wear my like rowing onesie to class because we were on the water from
Sure.
5 something until 7 something. Yeah, by the time we came back, it was time for class, and I would sort of roll into that, and so I'd already had such an embodied morning.
I love it.
Yeah. So,
Fascinating. So I interrupted you though, all about rowing. So you arrived here from Chicago. Did you have any sort of initial instinctual kind of ideas about what you wanted to study, or were you more sort of all over the map?
yeah. So, I let go of journalism once I realized I was going to a liberal arts college.
Ah,
I was like, that's not a thing that we do. I had looked at Indiana University as a possibility. I'd been considering it like to do like a serious study of pre-professional
yes.
journalism. And I let that go and decided to get a humanistic education. And so, yeah, from the very beginning, I was thinking about majoring in theater. Like I filled my schedule with theater classes.
Yeah.
Also throughout, though, took a lot of courses in other areas. I know that the PAD now is more interdisciplinary now that there is a more robust theater and performance studies program that is
Yes.
sort of like adjunctive to the studio-based classes. That was less the case at the time. So
Right.
I filled out my schedule because I was really interested in critical race studies, gender studies, literature. I
Right.
filled out my schedule of classes in those departments in those areas as well. And I
Love
was
it.
also at the time thinking about being a French major or a French minor. So I
Oh,
also
nice.
seriously studied French for 3 of my years at WashU.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And then besides rowing, is that what we call it? What else did you sort of do in an interdisciplinary, or should I say, extracurricular way?
Rowing and theater. I mean, I
Yeah.
sure there was something else that I did,
Yeah.
Rob, but that is what I remember. I was involved somewhat with the Hillel. I'm Jewish, and there was a program. I was actually not involved with the Hillel because it seemed so much more formal and conservative in some ways than my spirituality
Mm-hmm.
program. I don't remember when it fell in my studies, but at some point I was recruited through Hillel. There was a grant through the Shoah Foundation to recruit inactive Jewish students to do more Jewish student life on campus. And so we
Oh,
had there was a year-long program where we met, I think, weekly and did Jewish studies. So not like a focus on Jewish faith practices, but like a humanistic study of
right.
Jewish literature, Jewish identity, Jewish politics. I loved it. And it culminated in a trip to Israel, Palestine, which we could talk about.
Sure.
That's complex now. At the
Yeah.
time, I did not have as developed of an analysis of what that meant and settler colonization and all of those things. So at the time, I was just delighted to be traveling to Israel and Palestine. And it itself, it was not a Zionist mission. It also, I remember we met with Palestinians and Bedouins, and it was very formative in a lot of ways.
Oh,
Anyway, so that was also something outside of the PAD that I was involved with.
sure.
Yeah.
Sure. And in what ways did the PAD or your work sort of adjacent to it, how did that sort of develop what you eventually became? Was it a sort of accomplished author,
Yeah.
artist, teacher? Like, how did were those seeds sort of planted at that stage?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know how many PAD alums end up becoming theater professors, but it's like I have entered, I could not enter the field any more squarely in relationship to my studies than I have become them.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, I would say that, as I was saying, like most of the work that I did in the PAD, I was in a lot of productions, and I took all of the courses, which at the time were mostly studio based. So the full acting sequence 1 through 4, taking Andrew Urice's creative impulse class, which was so foundational to me. It was movement for actors class. My senior year, Anne Bogart came, so we got really rigorous training as well in the codified system of the viewpoints. And that actually, Anne Bogart came to WashU, and a couple of members of her company as well as like
Wow.
Linda Chapman and Lola Pashalinski, because they were doing a production of Gertrude and Alice, A Likeness to Loving, because there was a Gertrude Stein festival happening in the English department that year. Anyway, it just felt very serendipitous. Felt like a very serendipitous time to be at WashU and in the PAD. So, which is all to say, a lot of the work that I did in the PAD was, and I think this is why I said rigorous, very rigorous, almost conservatory style training in acting and directing, but primarily acting. And I started becoming very interested and serious about directing my senior year. And my thesis was a directing project, and we could talk about that separately. But, and the training was Stanislavski based primarily, aside from the work that we did with Anna in movement and that we then did with the City Company, which sort of opened up this whole other world of physical theater. But prior to that, it was very Stanislavski based. And even though that is such a small part of my practice now, like I wouldn't say that that's how I approach theater making now, partly because I don't do a lot of traditional work or naturalistic style work. And so I'm coming at the work with slightly different aims. And so the approaches are different. But that required us to do so much script analysis, both as actors and as directors, because I'm also thinking about in directing how rigorous our script analysis was. And that taught me how to do close reading, which was so instructive for me, not just as a young actor, so that I was coming at the work with such a robust understanding of what was happening psychologically for the characters, as well as, if you're doing good script analysis, you're also looking beyond psychology. I'm sure you all still teach the essay, EF's Visit to a Small Planet, some questions to ask a play. It's this foundational essay about how to read a play. And it's like only so much of it is psychological. You're tracking color and light and texture. I mean, I don't need to tell you this, you're a designer.
Yeah.
So, thinking that way about plays was so foundational, not only to the work that I would do later in theater and performance studies, but also it made me a really good artist.
Oh, fantastic.
So, and the physical training, people think of Stanislavski-based training as psychological, but it's also so physical. So I think that laid the foundation both for the scholarly work that I do now in theater and performance studies and the writing that I do now, really attending really carefully to words. And then also the work that I do as a practitioner, which even though it's not Stanislavski based, that level of rigor and detail, I feel like seeds in that training that I did at WashU.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic. So moving forward, I guess chronologically, did you graduate with a major in drama, or how was it a combination of things?
Yeah. So maybe they've changed the language now. At the time, it was performing arts was the major.
Yeah.
And that was my major. And then we had, I don't know if this is official or unofficial, but you had like tracks that you specialize in. I don't know if that appears on any document outside of, a colloquial use of like, I was on the whatever track, but I was on 2 tracks. I was on the acting track and what at the time we called theater culture studies or something like that.
Oh, yes. Yeah. TCS, or TPS, theater practice, or TCS is, I think I've heard TCS. There's a series of classes, TCS classes, that have been replaced, or I should say renamed in a sense, but that's fascinating. So after WashU, did you immediately go to graduate school at Texas, or where did you go after that?
Yeah. All right. Let's try to remember. So I graduated WashU in 99.
Yeah.
And then I moved to Chicago for a period of time, and I was doing theater in Chicago. I was both like making theater. I started doing some sound design at WashU as well.
Oh, really? Nice.
I designed a few shows, and so I was doing some directing and assistant directing and acting in Chicago, and then a little bit of sound design. It was, a great town for a young theater artist because there's
absolutely,
companies to work with. And then I was also starting to do teaching, like after school arts programs in the Chicago Public Schools.
Nice.
So that was also the beginning of that part of my career. And then I left Chicago and I moved to New York. Initially, the plan was to study with the city company and to work with Mary Overly, who I had encountered at some point while I was in college, not at WashU. Like I took a workshop with her in Chicago. And she was like, come, I don't know if you know Mary Overly, but she's since passed, but she was an extraordinary artist, but also like, real out of the box thinker. So she just like looked at me. This is also like, the 90s where people like maybe like did things like this. Come to New York. She was just like, I want to give you, I'll never forget this because I took it seriously. I don't know that she meant it seriously in retrospect, but she said, I took this workshop. She had me go on stage and she was like, I want you to explore time, which, there's no category more vast than time. She's like, time. I was like, cool. So I get on stage. She leaves me up there for like an hour exploring. Little did she know that would become my area of research.
Yes. And so, your first book is called Time Slips.
Yes. And that is what I was doing on stage for an hour. I was slipping around through time. So anyway, I did that. She was like somewhat impressed with my exploration of time. And she said, she like looked at me dead in the eyes and she said, come to New York. I'll give you a home and a studio and I want to study you.
What?
I know. And I was like, Mary Overly is going to give me a home and a studio and she wants to study me. So I got on a train and I went to New York.
I love it.
And I signed up for classes with the city company who I'd connected with at WashU. And I was a real fan of their work as well as their training.
Of course.
And then about a week after I moved to New York City, 9/11 happened. And that scrambled everything.
Wow. Literally a week after you arrived. Oh, interesting.
Yeah. My lease was a September 1.
Yeah.
2001. Yeah. So that was New York. And then I was there for a short period of time. And from there, it was like 3 years after I'd graduated in 2002. I moved to Austin to start grad school.
Got it. And what drew you to? I mean, I'm from Austin, so I'm a big fan. It's not a visual podcast, but I'm wearing my Texas gear today, just for this podcast because I'm a big fan and know that you ended up there. What drew you to UT Austin?
A few things. I mean, honestly, at that moment. So now, I'm applying shortly after 9/11, and my intentions initially were to go to NYU.
Okay.
Or Columbia. So part of my move to New York was thinking I was going to get rooted in New York and then apply to some grad programs in New York. And I was looking at the performance studies program at NYU and the directing program at Columbia. And I visited, I don't want to say anything disparaging about any of my colleagues, but what I'll say is that when I visited the performance studies program at NYU, I was like, this is not quite right for me.
Yeah, you just know. Yeah.
I just knew it wasn't a good match.
Yeah.
At the time, it did not have the feminist foundation that it may now.
Fair.
So, and I was very attracted to the program at UT Austin, which was the very inception of what they now call performance as public practice. It was founded by Jill Dolan. And so I was drawn to the curriculum there. I mean, that's true. And I was very struck by a lot of things, and we could talk about that. But the other piece, the program was very queer. It was very feminist. But the other piece of it was that I wanted to get out of New York. I was so traumatized by 9/11.
Fair. Yeah.
That I was like, get me out of here. And how far away can I go? So Texas seemed really far, and that made it feel safer.
Oh, good. That's good. Yeah. It's a kind of town. I mean, you know this as well as anyone, that it's just a little, I don't know, it's a little quirky. Keep Austin weird is a bit of a mantra that runs around Austin, and people are proud of the fact that it's just different than certainly the rest of Texas, I'll say. But
yeah, I loved Austin. It was like, in many ways, the happiest. I was there for, I think, 8 years of my life.
Yeah.
And my PhD.
Gotcha. And now you found, I don't mean to skip too far, but now you find yourself as you mentioned earlier, as a professor at Penn State Abingdon
Yeah.
in the, let's see, the Integrative Arts faculty,
Yeah.
which I find really super interesting. Can you talk a little bit about your time as a professor? Now that you're on the other side, you
Yeah.
mentioned being in the PAD, and I'm sure,
Yeah.
at least in my time, I always thought that there was a lot of some magic that happened
Yeah.
behind the scenes, but it's actually kind of some contentious arguments and things like that
I know.
not arguments, but disagreements that lead to change, and change is a difficult thing sometimes in academia.
Yeah. I mean, I'll start by saying, yeah, the veil is lifted when you become a professor.
Sure.
That's what was happening. And so I have so much renewed respect for my professors from undergrad because never did I have the slightest clue
Mhm.
that there was anything complex or fraught about teaching or about academia, right? Like
Sure.
they were so present. And since this is a PAD alumni interview, I'll be specific. And I know some of these folks have recently retired and or are still there, but Bill Whitaker, Jeffrey Matthews, Edward Urice, Anna Pileggi, Henry Chevet. That was like God, I hope I'm not forgetting somebody. I think that was the core faculty.
They're all still here except for Henry. Henry
Yeah,
just
anyway,
retired.
hey, I have so much affection for all of them. And they were all so present with us in class.
Oh,
And we had personal relationships. Like I babysat for Jeffrey, I house sat for Bill. Don't ask him about sort of damage that I did to his house once while I was there. Anyway, like we had personal relationships. Anna and Opal would have us over for dinner
oh,
at the end of the semester.
so sweet.
So sweet. Henry would have groups of us over for Passover Seders.
Oh, I love it.
Like we're still in town. So we were in each other's lives in a real way, or at least what to me as the student felt like a real way.
Yeah.
I now know that was always work, right? Like
Mhm.
it's like, oh, Anna and I are best friends. I'm like, oh yes, I'm sure Anna has real affection for me, but she's also working when she has us over for dinner.
Yeah,
And so
sure.
yeah, it's like a real respect for the ways in which I feel like I was mentored and nurtured as a human being. And it's an incredible amount of labor for a faculty member to do outside of class and in class. They were so present with us. And now I know I go into class and, sometimes it's a good teaching day and sometimes it's not as good of a teaching day. And, Rob, you stay composed and yeah, so just an awareness of that labor. Um,
Uh,
of
it's so kind of you to say, and so true as well. I mean, I like to think of teaching. Sometimes I compare it to improv. I find it boring, and I think my own students would find it boring if I just read from a paper directly to them. So I have a slideshow and I have some interesting video clips, perhaps, but it's all at the moment when I'm present. I feel like I do the best job teaching when I'm just triggered by what I see, what the visual is, what I mean to say when I see that visual, and like you said, it makes you more present as a teacher. Yeah, I did a lecture yesterday. I teach a wonderful class on creativity. By the way, I did co-teach Creative Impulse with Andrea Urice for a year, and that sort of laid the foundation and the seeds for the class I now teach. That's 80 students, 80 first-year students, called Designing Creativity. And I did a lecture yesterday on play. And at 8:30 in the morning, I plant a giant beach ball and cover it with black fabric because that's what we do in theater when things are, quote, invisible, right? And I plant it in the corner of the room. And then at 1 o'clock, many hours later, I have class. And at a certain point, I have the students close their eyes and to sort of demonstrate the instinctual rules in play. I have them close their eyes and I launch this beach ball into the air. And while it's up there, I say, open your eyes. And they, instinctually do play with this beach ball all around the room. They make sure everybody has a chance to kind of bat it around. We occasionally dislodge a ceiling tile at times. But it's only sort of an example, I think, of the work that it takes to pull off a good lecture. It's a bit of an improv performance, as you know now as your teacher. So I would love for you to plug, if you don't mind, this integrative arts program you have going there? Because I personally find it fascinating.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So, I teach now at Penn State at the Abington campus, and I'll
Right.
say you asked about like sort of my teaching career more broadly. It's I now have tenure as of last year. But thank you. It's been a very long journey. Like I began teaching in as an adjunct faculty member at Hampshire College in 2010 and had a string of visiting appointments that would last anywhere from 1 year to the longest visiting appointment I had, which was at Haverford, 4 years. And then I started the tenure track at Reed College. That didn't, and I wanted to come back to Philadelphia, sort of like jumped the track and, started on, a new tenure track position at Penn State and then, was awarded tenure here. So I've been teaching for a really long time in a lot
Yeah.
of institutional contexts. And because of that, because I'm in a couple of interdisciplinary fields already, like the work that I do is already interdisciplinary. Like
Yeah.
I do theater as a practitioner and theater studies. So I'm like squarely rooted in our art form. And I have a training in and a real commitment to performance studies, a larger lens, a more cultural studies lens. And then I have a real commitment to gender studies and critical race studies and critical disability studies and sort of larger conversations about power and what art and performance, how they are able to engage with sort of questions of power and oppression and liberation. And so my work is already, and I feel like the seeds of this were planted at WashU with the studies that I did across the college, is already interdisciplinary. So I wouldn't even know how to teach theater in a non-interdisciplinary
Fair.
integrative way because theater is about all of
Everything. Yeah, exactly. Yes. Yes. I love it.
So, the program, so to your question, the program that I teach for now is integrative arts, which is flagging relationship between theater, dance, music. And the courses that I teach are sort of across media. So like right now I'm teaching a course that the pop name for the course is Queer Kinship. And that's a class that I started developing when I was a visiting faculty member at Haverford. The official name on the books is LGBTQ identity, culture, and the arts. And we look at questions of kinship as it relates to cultural production, by which I mean we're looking at some critical theory of gender and sexuality and other overlaps. And then we're looking at theater and we're looking at performance art and we're looking at film and we're looking at poetry and we're looking at, other expressions and representations to think through like a thematic question. So yeah, that's what sort of having an integrative approach or an interdisciplinary approach means to me.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by that. It sounds like a fascinating course to take, and I'm sure your students just love it.
Too. Yeah. And when you tag courses like that, then it becomes an affinity space. So like here is in the title of the class, you get a bunch of queer students, which is amazing. I love being in a room with young queer and trans people. I learned so much.
Of course. Yeah, that's fascinating. I wondered if we, I think we'd spend a whole nother half hour talking about your arts practice, but is there anything that you'd like? You are, I think, Austin Chronicle, one of my favorite newspapers from when I was growing up in Austin, called you an alchemist walking among us, an artistic alchemist. I find your work so interesting. I'm thinking specifically of Loving Description, any of those types of things, the Austin Project. Do you find that your art practice sort of invigorates your teaching and writing? Like, it's an all sort of a symbiotic relationship across those three?
Thank you for asking that. Yeah, I wouldn't know how to do just one of those things.
Sure.
And yeah, I feel like, the Loving Description Project, which you named, which I'll just sort of say for our
Sure,
listeners,
please. Yeah.
is a site-specific writing project. So that's a project that I started with my friend and colleague, Lindsay Rexon, and she's based here in Philadelphia and teaches at Haverford. We have also co-taught a class last year on archives at Haverford. And part of the class was also me working with students. It was also partly an artist residency where I was working with students and then working with some professional colleagues on my current large-scale performance project, which is called 24-Hour Medea, which we could talk about sort of in a separate moment if you want. But
sure.
That project is a project that we started because we were interested in what it might mean to publishing is so slow,
Hmm.
particularly, well, all forms, but like, if we think of art criticism and performance criticism, you have this immediate experience seeing something and then you write about it. And depending on what form it is, if it's an essay, a journal, it'll come out, maybe if you're lucky, a year later, a book 10 years later,
Yeah.
it's very not immediate.
Yes.
And the work is so immediate. And your experience, your emotional experience of the work is so tied to that cultural moment. And so we're
Hmm.
like, how can we have the writing that we do about art and culture and performance mirror the immediacy as well as the ephemerality of the work that we're describing? So we started this project that we called Loving Description, which is a nod to Susan Sontag. She has a famous essay against interpretation where she uses the phrase loving description, where she's saying, stop analyzing things, don't deconstruct things, don't tell me what it means. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. Just and this is how I teach my students to write about performance, is thick description. So that's what we do. So we'll see something. Sometimes it's an art exhibit. Sometimes it's a performance. I just wrote about a protest.
Hmm.
And we write about it, very short form, one
Yep.
page. So it's usually like 250 to 300 words. And then we go back the next day or a few days later, and we post the writing at the site where it happened, and then we document it. And so, to answer your question, like, is there a symbiotic relationship between them? I think that it's like different things need different engagements. And so
Yeah.
when I'm writing about something, it's because I'm compelled to write. Like, I'm like, what this needs is an archive. Like the greatest gift that I could give to an artist or an activist, but in most cases an artist, in the context of that project, is a description of their work. I can archive it, sort of like
Yeah.
writing for history, even if it's like very ephemeral, or the few people that see that writing, it feels like archival work,
Of
in
course.
the sense of that term. And then, like, when I'm making performance, somebody recently, a friend just asked me, like, why do you make performance? And I was like, make performance when I need to work something out with my body. Like,
Mm,
when my brain, which includes my writerly brain, can't quite work it through.
of course.
And there's nothing to sort of like churn the mill more than moving my body in time and space. So yeah, when I'm drawn to making performance, like 24-hour Medea, which is a project I'm working on now, which is at its core, it's a durational performance that lasts 24 hours, where we repeat Medea, the Greek tragedy, 24 times every hour on the hour for an entire day, with
Wow.
variation, which naturally happens through repetition, to see if we could break down the story and find a different outcome. So it's ultimately a play about violence and if it's overdetermined, and theater and if it's overdetermined. So it's like a question about liveness, and like if it's possible to actually get off script to like something that seems as intractable as a Greek tragedy,
Yes. Yes.
if it's possible to break that open. And so
Hmm.
why am I making a performance about that rather than writing about it? I need I need to figure it out with
Yeah.
my body and with other bodies in space. And, teaching, I feel like that's where I work out my most nascent. Well, I think it's both. It's where I work out my most nascent
Hmm.
questions and thoughts, because, you could go into a classroom and have a question and then spend an hour to 3 hours with people exploring that question. So it's very
Yeah.
oriented. Or it's where occasionally I'll teach things that are tried and true. And I'm like, this is just, everybody needs to read Audre Lorde's Uses of the Erotic.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Also where I feel like I'm doing sort of the other end of the spectrum, which is, I don't know the word, but like mentorship, I guess, where I'm like connecting folks who are a very different generation from
Yeah.
me, genealogy that preceded them. So I don't
Hmm.
know if that answers your question. So it's,
Oh, it does.
form follows function.
Yeah, and yeah, the symbiotic relationship between your art, your teaching, and your writing, it makes perfect sense to me. As a fellow artist, someone who's written a book, one of the hardest things I ever had to do was write this book. And it was such a slow, I guess if I were to use a terrible analogy perhaps about, gardening, it's like a drip irrigation versus like just being watered. Like it was one of those things where I'm like, I just need to keep writing words and think of it as paint on a canvas I can alter later if I hate it. But I just have to like hold myself to this just drip, drip, drip of content, and then hopefully that can be sort of molded or sculpted into something. But I totally get it. And then the arts practice side of me, I mean, as a designer, I think my longest really any kind of design project is like 6 to 9 months, start to finish. So opening night, backwards to when you first get asked to do the job is about that long. And so that's much more sort of, I guess, almost immediate, if you want to think of it that way, satisfaction about things. Totally get that. I totally can relate to that. So thank you for that kind of window into your process, whether it be writing or teaching or art. Is there anything else you want to chat about? I think we could talk for another, like I said, solid half hour, but I like to keep these somewhat short for our listeners. I like to think of them as a walk, a dog walk, or doing, laundry kind of
Yeah.
length of time. I'm really very grateful to you for your time and very excited to talk to you today about your time at WashU and all the wonderful colleagues that you mentioned. I'll make sure that they know that you think fondly of them when you were here.
Yeah, so much. Yeah, I don't know I definitely don't need to say more about myself. I'm trying to think if there's anything we haven't that I want to say about WashU and the PAD. And I was thinking about yesterday, anticipating this conversation, I was reflecting on, I didn't prepare any of these responses, but I was reflecting on my time at WashU. And
Sure.
I was thinking about one thing we haven't talked about is I did the London program.
Oh, yes.
That was
The Globe.
Yeah, the Globe.
Yeah.
And at the time, I know it rotates. At the time, it was Henry Chevet and Bill Whitaker were our teachers that summer. And Henry taught directing and Bill taught acting. And that was so foundational for me. I mean, partly the training and then partly being in London. And at the time, it was somewhat lost on me, too, because, I was like, we performed on the Globe stage. I don't think I had a sense of sort of the scale of what was happening. Like I performed Hamlet's To Be or Not to Be monologue, which tells you something about like me as an undergrad and like how ambitious I was. They were like, "What monologue do you want to do?" I was like, "I'll do Hamlet's To Be or Not to Be monologue." On the Globe stage, I remember a session that we had with Bill. I mean, talk about rigor. We were working on what monologue is that? I remember the text. It's leashed in like hounds. What Shakespeare play is that from?
I'm trying to.
Okay,
I don't know.
Google it. You'll tell us later.
I'll look it up and insert it right here later. Leashed in Like Hounds is from Henry V.
I don't remember what play it is, but I just remember how carefully we were moving through the text. So it was just such good training. And, I'm not an early modernist. The only Shakespeare play I've ever been in was my senior year. We did Midsummer at WashU. And that was incredible. I got to play Puck. And
fantastic.
So gender affirming and so fun. That's Corey and I. So Corey was Oberon.
Was he really? Oh.
Yeah. Oh my God. I mean, can't you hear his voice?
Oh, he'd make a spectacular Oberon. Yes. Yes. He was Caliban in a Tempest I did at the Utah Shakespeare Festival. And King John in King John. He was a rarely done Shakespeare piece, but he was fantastic in it. It's so interesting you mentioned this because I just yesterday, and this is one of my favorite things about teaching is having just one-on-one meetings with students that just asked to talk, and this young man wanted to talk about just life, and he's in his literally 6th week of college at WashU. He's in my creativity class, and what I hear you saying in your story is sort of illustrative of what he was talking about, and it's this wonderful creative courage that you have as a first-year student in college. I would think because you don't know what you don't know, and so you just take big swings because you have, in a wonderful, beautiful, elegant way, you have no fear, and you just taste all the ice cream and you're like, yeah, I'm going to do Hamlet on the Globe stage. That's not intimidating at all, not to a 20-year-old. That's a fantastic way to go.
No, it's intimidated. And partly how I'm praising our faculty is at no point did anybody try to inhibit me. Because Bill could have been like, I don't know, Jack. Like, that monologue's kind of overdone at this point. There's really nothing new to do with it. He was like, great,
Yeah,
So yeah, it's exactly what you're saying. It's like these huge swings, and you're so young, you have no idea how naive you are. And it is upon your professors to never tell you.
exactly.
And so I felt just so incredibly supported. The other thing I was going to say about the Globe program is we saw incredible work. Which
I bet.
I saw my first Sarah Kane play.
Mm-hmm.
Saw Blasted. I didn't know who Sarah Kane was, but I was like, we saw a bunch of stuff also at Stratford upon Avon, and incredible production of Hamlet, Stratford, like a life-changing production of King Lear. Anyway,
Wow.
seeing that work still seared in my memory, so foundational, that caliber of both contemporary and not contemporary work.
So exciting. Some years ago, I was grateful enough to have a grad student project go to the Prague Quadrennial, which, for those that don't know, is like the Olympics of set design. And being in Prague for 10 days, I think I saw 9 different types of theater. I saw blacklight theater and marionette theater. And, for $3, I saw something at La Terna Magica, Joseph Sabota's theater. I saw, it was such an inspiring 10 days to sort of, light a fire. Which was speaking of teaching, one of my favorite quotes is, the education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire. And it sounds like that's what, it might be a good thing to end on. That's sort of what, hopefully what PAD did for you, was just light that fire, and to have colleagues like Bill Whitaker say, yeah, do it. Do Hamlet on the Globe stage, as opposed to like, hang on a second.
Totally.
I love it. I love it. Well, Jack, thank you so much for your time. Dr. Jack Isaac Pryor, thank you so much for your time on the PAD podcast. I'm just so delighted to share your story with so many, hopefully, other listeners, and primarily prospective students who may be at a juncture in their lives and thinking about what they want to do. And I find your story very, very inspiring. So for that, I'm very, very grateful.
Thank you so much for having me. It's also just like so lovely to be able to reflect on these experiences.
Well, that's great.
I really appreciate this opportunity. When you were just talking about lighting a fire, I was like, oh, I have a new answer to the question.
Sure.
I've grown from this conversation, Rob.
Good. So just say your name, and then the PAD taught me.
Yeah. Only if you include both answers in the podcast.
I can do that. I have no rules.
Do whatever you want, Rob, as the editor. My name is Jack Isaac Pryor, and the PAD taught me courage.
All right. My thanks to Dr. Jack Isaac Pryor for their time and honesty and candor to really talk about their time at WashU and beyond. If you, yes, you, would like to be a guest on the podcast, please reach out. I would love to do that. We like to elevate and celebrate our alums, and you are one of them. If you're listening to this and you are a PAD alum or alumni adjacent, if you had anything to do with PAD, please reach out. We'd love to have you on the podcast. Thank you.